Johnny Mack appearing via the Boardwalk Honda hotline. We're busy today. A lot of NFL news and notes. Let's get into it. John, how are you?
I'm doing well. Just sitting here trying to tamper as much as possible.
Yes, you're allowed to do it, so you might as well steal and do whatever else you need to do that is illegal at this time of the day. Let's start with the Eagles and their situations going on right now. We know that they've made a couple of trades, and Rappaport tweeting earlier that they intend to bring back Patrick Robinson. Is that a little bit of a surprise?
No, they've been working on that for over a week now. So I knew they wanted him back. The question is, could they get him back? And Ian's report was they were hoping to get something done before the tampering window opened. So they weren't able to do that. So now, obviously, other people can talk. And once you get to that position, the number could get to a point where you can't bring him back. But the Eagles realized how important he was for that defense. He was the best nickel cornerback in football last year. It's a very, very difficult position to replace. We've talked about it a lot on the show. People can't just say Sidney Jones is going to be there and assume they can just replace guys and rotate guys because it's a completely different position. So the Eagles know his value, and they certainly want him back. I think they will get him back, and I think that's a very, very prudent move for them.
John, I guess what's the domino if he is back? Because the trade the other day, Worley seemed like they were adding another piece to get rid of somebody. I guess some people assumed, well, if they lost Robinson, they added another guy into the fold. But Worley's not a slot guy, so it almost still seemed like Robinson was essential. So does this kind of still point to Darby?
Yeah, I mean, if they're going to trade a corner, it would be Darby. And for a number of reasons. One, this is the last year of his rookie deal upcoming. He'll probably get a pretty lucrative extension if he plays even decently, because he does have a lot of talent. So you have to think about sort of building your roster in 2-year increments and think about the salary. It might be next year as well. You do have some depth at the position, but he's the one who could probably bring the most back in return, other than a Sidney Jones who you don't want to move. So those all enter into it. But there's also a little caveat to Worley in the fact that a lot of people in this league project him long-term as safety. So I think if it comes down to it, and you look at the sort of job that Corey Graham did last year as that third rotating safety, which allowed Jim Schwartz to do a lot of different things with Malcolm Jenkins. Well, Corey's an unrestricted free agent as well. If you can't bring him back, you need that third safety if you want to continue playing that same style of defense. Who knows? They can move Worley back to safety.
Hey, real quick on Patrick Robinson, 31 years old in September. He had the 1-year deal and obviously had a really good year. Do you have any reason for pause to say, you know what, maybe he just had one big breakout season and I'd be apprehensive about signing him to a big deal?
Well, yeah, I mean, you have to have a little pause because he's had good seasons before, but he's also had a lot of injury issues in the past. He's never really put together 2 good seasons in a row. So you start thinking that way. Well, this is the second season. It's probably not going to be like last season. The positive is, obviously, he's fit in very well in the culture of this defense and this locker room. He's sort of found his calling as a slot corner. I think that's his natural position. He's got short area quickness. He's very smart. He's a veteran. He's got savvy. He understands route running and what receivers are trying to do. So from that standpoint, I think it's all good. And I think as long as he does stay healthy, he's going to remain productive. So that's the way I think the Eagles look at it, is the fact that he sort of found his calling later in his career. And I think they're right.
John McMullen with us. John, if they pay Patrick Robinson, and that reports to be believed that they're going to try to find a way to keep him, does that then hurt their ability to keep a guy like Nigel Bradham? Because we've talked on this show about how important they feel Nigel Bradham is moving forward.
Yeah, they can't keep everyone, and Howie's been honest about that. Doug Peterson's been honest about that as well. And the two people we kind of always talk about are Trey Burton and Bo Allen, because I don't think there's any chance either of those will be back. And Nigel might be in that category now. When you have Jordan Hicks coming back from the Achilles injury, remember, you can only play two linebackers because you're going to have that fit defensive back on the field 70% of the time. So you don't really need three playing significant time. And I think if the Eagles had their druthers, they'd rather have Nigel Bradham than Michael Kendricks. But the reality is Michael's under contract. He gets paid significant money. You can't pay him both. And maybe they just ran out of time. Howie likes to make deals. Maybe he would have liked to move Michael Kendricks to potentially re-sign Nigel Bradham. But sometimes the clock runs out on you. Sometimes you can't get these things done. And by all accounts, there's significant interest, to no surprise, around the league in Nigel Bradham.
We've praised Howie and the Eagles for their handling over the cap and how they handle the cap, but they've never been in this position. Have they been before, John, where they've been so much over the cap going into this period?
Well, few teams have, to tell the truth. It's only one or two that's in this type of situation every year. They were in a bad salary cap situation last year as well. Howie tends to figure out ways, but the reality is, and remember, none of these moves that we've all reported in recent days, the trades can be official until Wednesday. So the Eagles have taken on a lot of money in Michael Bennett. They'll obviously regain some of that money. You have Donnie Jones's retirement as well. And right now, as we stand here today, they're about $11 million over the cap. So there's a lot of shoes that have to drop before Wednesday. And, we know some of them. Vinny Curry most likely is going to be traded or released. They still have to answer the question about Brett Selleck, who's got a big number and wants to play, possible restructure. So there's going to be a number of moves happening.
Yeah, there's 13 pending unrestricted free agents. We talked about Bradham a little bit. You talked about the obvious Trey Burton and Brian Brayman and Bo Allen and guys out there. Bo Allen and Trey Burton, but there's other names out there: Darren Sproles, Kenyon Barner, LeGarrette Blount. We did discuss Patrick Robinson. I mean, these blocks are going to start getting shifted, and there may be some popular names that don't return.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be difficult for this team, and that's where the sentimentality comes in that Howie talked about, and you have to sort of get past it. And we're at that stage where you turn the page from the Super Bowl, at least from a business standpoint. I know the fans will always regard that team as legendary, and they'll walk together in history. A little Fred Shiro reference for you, Pete.
But, I like it.
The reality is they can't bring them all back. And they just and they're not going to be all back, and that's part of the business side of the NFL.
Yeah, I saw the headline that said, with the Eagles over the salary cap, the NFL free agency is when that Super Bowl bill comes due, like time to pay.
Yeah, and people have won the Super Bowl, not been over the cap. So it's been a long and arduous process since Howie retook the sort of the stewardship of this team. And we talked about some of the moves in the past that Chip Kelly made, and they've tried to reverse course. They've done it very successfully on the field, almost remarkably quickly. But to do that, they've obviously spent a lot of money and made a lot of moves to where they're in a situation that it's going to be difficult for the next 2 years, really. And Howie has admitted that.
John McMullen's with us on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline, looking at the NFL. A lot of storylines out there. Which are the guys that are the free agents? You got Burton, you got Bradham. Which of the guys do you think has the least chance of coming back?
Trey Burton, because I think he's going to get paid like a starter in this league. I think there's, at least a half dozen teams have already called his agent to talk to him. You saw Cameron Brate re-signed to Tampa today, got a 6-year deal for $41 million. 18, I think, was guaranteed. That's the important number. And I think he can kind of use that as a template for the type of contract he might get. And he's not going to be able to play enough here because of the presence of Zach Ertz. And obviously you're not going to pay a backup tight end that type of money, especially when you're as cash-strapped as the Eagles. So if I were to rate potential guys coming back versus not coming back, the trigger man of the Philly special, he's 99.9% gone.
Yep, that would be Burton, obviously, and then you've got guys like Nigel Bradham, who we'll see. We haven't heard his name a whole heck of a lot, but we would assume that there's going to be teams that are interested in bringing him back. And then you mentioned Ronald Darby, a potential trade candidate. So some big names could be moving. This team could have a different look. We know Vinny Curry's name. I saw Ian Rappaport tweeting that his name has been circulating in the trade market as well. You hinted that, Brandon Graham could be an under-the-radar guy to keep a look at. And then, of course, the uncertainty of what Chris Long.
If not for a trade on Brandon Graham, maybe they reduce his number under a new deal. But as far as Chris Long goes, John, that's exactly who I wanted to ask you about, because I know he expressed some uncertainty that he might be back. And do you think Chris Long is a situation where the Eagles might move on?
Yeah, it's a possibility. It's not a lot of money. They would gain about $2 million, but every sort of penny counts when you're in the type of situation the Eagles have. He's got a $500,000 roster bonus coming up on March 18th, so that's the day you'll kind of know the Eagles will declare whether they're bringing him back or not. And from his standpoint, he's also, at least mulling over, at least thought about retirement. Because for him, obviously, he's won back-to-back Super Bowls. And one of the reasons he left New England for Philadelphia was because at this stage of his career, he wanted a better scheme for his talents. And he also wants to be able to play. And if the Eagles do keep Brandon Graham, and they do have Michael Bennett, and they obviously have Derek Barnett, perhaps there's not enough snaps for Chris Long to be happy with, and he might walk away on his own. It's a possibility.
How much does winning the Super Bowl give the Eagles some sort of play with veteran guys like Brent Selleck or Jason Peters, for example, two guys that the Eagles may try to convince to take pay cuts, and that's a tough thing to do, to convince a guy to take less money to play for the team?
Well, I think it's always a great recruiting tool, not only when you won the Super Bowl, but you also have a star and a franchise quarterback in Carson Wentz. And one of the reasons Alshon Jeffrey came here last year on a one-year sort of prove-it deal was because he thought correctly, as it turns out, that Carson Wentz was going to be a superstar in this league. So, if you have that Lombardi Trophy in the case and you have a star quarterback, you can not only get guys to take less who are here, it's also a helpful recruiting tool for some of those one-year prove-it deals, because that's what the Eagles will be looking for in the free agent market. They were so successful last season with the Patrick Robinsons of the world, the Garrett Blunts of the world. That's a very, very big recruiting tool when you're looking at players like that who might not, stop your heart and create the fan base to go nuts at the time they're signed, but they could end up proving to be very, very valuable players.
John, let's look at the NFL. A lot of movement, a lot of talk today. Let's start with some of the big names. Dolphins are planning on moving on from Ndamukong Suh. They've been hinting at this. He's even said he'd play for the Eagles for free, essentially. That was a big move a couple of years. It's funny. When you see all these free agents from like 2 and 3 years ago, you're starting to see a lot of those guys get the axe, and he's one of them.
Yeah, and he's made $60 million over the last 3 years, so he could play for the Eagles for free, and that would be a hell of an addition to this team, at least from a talent standpoint. But I don't believe him for a second that he would play for free, which essentially, by the way, Chris Long did last year. Didn't take his salary, donated it all to charitable causes. But he's still going to make a lot of money, not what he's used to. And obviously the Eagles won't be able to afford him. I think when he kind of whispered that the Dolphins were here in training camp to have those dual practices with the Eagles just after training camp. And I think that said more about, as I've said on the show, that said more about Adam Gase and the way he runs things than anything else.
The Cardinals are expected to move on from Adrian Peterson, but there has been some talk that they would look to bring him back because he's owed a bonus on Friday. So this is one of those, trying to skirt around the rules a little bit. But do you think there'll be a market for AP?
No, not much of one. There wasn't much of one last year. And I think if he wants to play, it's going to be a very low-level contract. It's going to be sort of a one-year prove-it deal at this stage. And for a team like the Cardinals, remember, they're getting David Johnson back from injury, so they don't need him. We saw the market wasn't there for him last year. And as I've told you a lot, Mike, despite his reputation, and he is one of the best pure runners I've ever seen in this game, he doesn't do anything else well. He doesn't pass block. He doesn't catch the football. So there isn't much market for running backs over 30 with his kind of injury history that are only two down players. So unfortunately, he might get a one-year deal somewhere from a desperate team, but we might be at the end of the line for Adrian Peterson.
All right, over the weekend, there were some moves of note. Let's talk some about that. John McMullen on the Boardwalk Honda hotline, at JF McMullen on Twitter. Richard Sherman, 3-year deal with the 49ers. Do you like this fit?
Well, I like it for the 49ers. I mean, obviously it's an upgrade. They tried to trade for Aqib Talib, but he didn't want to go there. Ended up with the Rams. They're looking for corners. They might bring in Trumaine Johnson. They still have a ton of money. And obviously you have that rivalry of the Seahawks and 49ers in the same division. He's coming off the Achilles tear. He's an upgrade, but you have to see how healthy he is. And, boy, he should have hired an agent because that is one team-friendly deal. So from the 49ers standpoint, it's not going to hurt him if Sherman isn't able to perform at a high level. But it is interesting because he probably could have took a pay cut in Seattle and stayed there and got probably more money, if anything, from the contract he got from San Francisco. So we always see that with veteran players. Sometimes they balk at asked to be taking a pay cut from where they've been, in his case, a Hall of Fame player, and they end up taking less in a different organization. It's always struck me as strange.
Yeah, that contract that Sherman negotiated himself is getting a lot of criticism around the league.
Well, it should. I mean, it's completely – and franchises have gotten much smarter at this. Howie Roseman is very good at it. Generally, you don't see many bad contracts, and Ndamukong Suh might have been the last bad contract we ever see in the NFL because it seems to be teams are too smart. But this one was really, really skewed towards the team. And if he did hire a veteran agent, that agent would have got him a better deal. There's no question about that.
A lot more NFL news here. Danny Shelton traded to the Patriots. The Browns were very busy on Friday.
Yeah, well, they're sort of the Sam Hickey, Brian Colangelo of the NFL, and they have all these assets, and now they have the football guy in place, and he's using some of those assets. And they were able to make some trades, and we'll see how it works out. Clearly, they're going to be better. it's tough to be worse.
Well, they added Tyrod Taylor late on Friday, as well. Right when the show was ending, they traded for Tyrod Taylor, so they did that, and then they traded their starting quarterback this year, Deshaun Kaiser, away to Green Bay.
Yeah, and they also brought in Demarius Randall, who they're going to move from corner to free safety. So they're doing a lot of things, and they still have a lot of draft capital. They still have a ton of money to go after free agents. But it was time to turn the page there. I mean, Hugh Jackson is 1-31 as a head coach. That's not sustainable. And they're starting to go in the right direction. It remains to be seen if they ever turn into a serious contender or even a mediocre team, but at least they're going in the right direction. And that's the first time you could say that in a long time for the Cleveland Browns.
All right, John, at the top of the quarterback list, we've got Cousins, there's Bradford, there's Bridgewater, there's Keenum. How is this quarterback tree going to start shaking?
Well, I think Kirk Cousins is going to make his decision, which will be the Vikings or the Jets. I ultimately think he will choose the Vikings because he's not a stupid man, but ultimately he's going to get anywhere. People have talked about 3 years fully guaranteed. I don't necessarily believe that because there's some sort of weird rules in the NFL. If you guarantee money, you have to put it in escrow, and that would be $90 million. That's a lot of money. I don't think teams would be willing to do that. So that's number one. Number two, I think the winner of that sort of battle is ultimately going to be a loser because we constantly talk about roster building in this league. And if you allocate $30 million a year for an above-average quarterback, and I like Kirk Cousins, but he's not a superstar, he's an above-average quarterback, well, the back end of your roster is going to take a significant hit. So I think the winner of that is the ultimate loser. I think the best value is Case Keenum, and I think he's going to end up in Buffalo or Denver for a decent price.
By the way, the Giants have informed Dominic Rodgers-Cromartie that he will be released. The Giants will save $6.5 by releasing him. And read John's piece on Mac Hollins at 973ESPN.com. That's something that you should dive into as well. So a lot of NFL. Free agency opens Wednesday. You were allowed to legally tamper starting a couple hours ago.
Tamper away.
So do what you have to do. Legally. Sorry. At JF McMullen on Twitter. Thanks, John.
Hey, thanks, guys.